He thought he'd come to this cabin to disappear quietly, to let the days blur together in silence after 12 years as a Navy SEAL. No missions, no teammates, no one needing him. Then one afternoon, a tiny German Shepherd puppy stepped out of the tree line, left a small piece of wood on his porch, and walked away like it had completed a mission. The next day, it came back with a bottle cap, then a bit of cord, then a smooth stone. Each tiny gift started to chip away at the walls he'd built, until he realized this little dog wasn't just asking for help, it was giving him a reason to live again. The cabin sat at the edge of a pine forest about 11 miles outside of Bend, Oregon, where the pavement ended and the gravel road narrowed to a single lane bordered by Douglas fir and silence. It belonged to Ronan Blake's uncle, a forest ranger who had kept the place for decades. And when Ronan's discharge papers came through in early November, his uncle had offered it without ceremony. Just a key pressed into his palm and 4 words: "Stay as long as needed." Ronan Blake was 37 years old. He had spent 12 years as a Navy SEAL, 6 deployments, 4 continents, operations that would never appear in any public record. He carried the weight of those years the way certain men carry old injuries, without complaint, without explanation, without ever quite putting the weight down. And now, 1 month out of service, he was standing in a kitchen the size of a walk-in closet, watching coffee drip into a cracked ceramic mug, trying to remember what a person without a mission was supposed to do at 7 in the morning. The answer, most days, was nothing in particular. He would make the coffee, carry it to the front porch, and sit in the wooden chair that listed slightly to the left, the one his uncle had never gotten around to fixing. He would watch the tree line where the pines stood in rows he had long since memorized, their shapes as familiar now as the faces of people he had once worked alongside. He would finish the coffee. He would go inside. He would eat something that required the fewest possible steps to prepare. Sometime in the early afternoon, he might read a few pages of a paperback he had found on the shelf, though he often couldn't recall afterward what he had read, as though the words passed through him without catching. By mid-afternoon, the light inside the cabin turned a particular shade of amber that felt, without his being able to say exactly why, like the color of something ending. He was not in crisis. That was the honest thing to acknowledge. He was not dangerous to himself or anyone else. He was not in the kind of darkness that required intervention or a phone call to the crisis line his discharge paperwork had listed in the back of a pamphlet he had not opened. He was simply lost. The particular lostness of a person who has spent so long moving toward a clear objective that the absence of the objective is itself a kind of vertigo. He had known how to function inside the discipline of service. He did not know how to function inside the open, unstructured days of the life he was now supposed to be living. Emma Caldwell came by twice a week. She was a forestry volunteer, mid-30s, dark hair pulled back with the casualness of someone who had stopped thinking about appearances. Somewhere around the time she started spending her weekends counting tree canopy density. She'd known Ronan's uncle for years, and she arrived with groceries, set the bag on the counter, and asked simply, "How are you eating? Sleeping okay?" When Ronan answered with the minimum syllables required to constitute a response, she would nod as though that were sufficient, say she'd be back Thursday, and leave. He appreciated that about her. She did not try to fix anything. That was the shape of Ronan Blake's life in the 3rd week of November, when the puppy appeared. It was late afternoon, the sky already going gray at the edges, the temperature dropping the way it does in the high Oregon desert, when the sun dips behind the ridge and takes all the warmth with it in under 10 minutes. Ronan was on the porch with his 2nd coffee of the day. He was staring at the mug, not thinking, precisely, more like occupying the space where thoughts should have been. He noticed the movement first, low to the ground, at the tree line, where the shadows were already pooling. His training did not disappear just because the uniform did. He set the mug on the railing and leaned forward. The light from the porch fixture caught it. A puppy. German Shepherd, or mostly, black and tan markings, dulled by whatever it had been sleeping in. It could not have been more than 5 or 6 weeks old, its oversized paws borrowed from a larger animal, its ears not quite upright yet, folding forward at the tips with a softness at odds with the seriousness of its expression. It was thin, not in the way of an animal that had missed a meal, but in the way of an animal for whom thinness had become its natural state, and it was carrying something. A piece of wood, pale, colored, roughly the length of a pencil, held carefully in its mouth with the intentionality of an animal that understood the value of what it was transporting. The puppy crossed the distance between the tree line and the porch steps with a measured pace, climbed the 2 steps, walked to the spot directly in front of Ronan's chair, and set the piece of wood down on the boards with a small, careful motion, the way you might place something on an altar. Then it stepped back 2 paces, sat, and looked up at him. Ronan Blake had stood in rooms with generals. He had received orders from men whose names appeared in Senate briefings. He had been in situations that reduced other trained operators to trembling, and he sat there on a crooked porch chair in the Oregon forest, looking at a flea-bitten German shepherd puppy the size of his forearm, and he laughed. It came out of him unexpectedly, the way a sound escapes when you've been holding your breath for a very long time and suddenly can't anymore. A real laugh. The kind that involved his whole chest, that surprised him as it was happening. The puppy watched him with an expression of supreme dignity, as though it had anticipated this reaction and found it neither flattering nor insulting, merely acceptable. Then, its mission apparently complete, it turned and walked back into the tree line. Ronan sat for a moment in the aftermath of his own laughter, which had already started to feel fragile. He leaned down and picked up the piece of wood. It smelled like earth and pine resin. He carried it inside and set it on the kitchen counter, next to the phone that had Emma Caldwell's number in it. The one he had not called once since arriving at the cabin. He looked at both of them for a long moment. Then he made soup and went to bed earlier than usual and slept straight through until 6. He did not call it waiting. The next morning, he made his coffee. He went to the porch. He sat in the lopsided chair and watched the tree line. He had simply come out at 6:30 rather than 7, and he had put on a proper flannel, rather than the undershirt he'd been wearing most days. And he noticed both of these facts without particularly wanting to examine them. The puppy came at 7:45, a bottle cap this time, blue plastic, bearing the small dents of teeth around the rim. It came to the same spot, set the bottle cap down with the same deliberateness, stepped back 2 paces, and sat. Ronan went inside, opened a can of chicken broth, thinned it with water until the salt content seemed reasonable for something this small, carried the bowl across the yard, set it down 10 feet from the puppy, and backed up to the porch steps. The puppy crossed to the bowl and ate. Fast, but not frantically, more like an animal that had learned to complete the task without distraction, because distraction had consequences. It finished, lifted its muzzle, regarded Ronan across the yard, and returned to the trees. That evening, Ronan picked up the phone and called Emma. "Do you know anything about feeding a puppy?" he said. There was a pause. "How old?" "Maybe 5 weeks, maybe 6, German shepherd." Another pause, and he could hear the quality of it. The kind of pause that contains a smile. "I can bring some things," she said. "I'll come tomorrow." The gifts continued, each morning, or sometimes afternoon. The puppy appeared at the tree line, crossed the yard, deposited its offering, and retreated. The objects were remarkable in their variety and their complete lack of monetary value: a strip of silver, gray cord, a shard of birch bark, a smooth flat stone, a rusted ring from what might have been a keychain, a dry leaf folded once along its center vein. Each time, Ronan left food and water and gave the puppy space. Each time, Ronan brought the object inside. He had started keeping them on the kitchen table, gathered toward one corner, accumulating the way meaningful things accumulate, when you don't quite have the words to explain why they're meaningful. Emma, when she came by, looked at them once and looked at Ronan once and said nothing, which was the correct response. She brought puppy formula, soft food, and eventually kibble, dispensing the knowledge of a growing animal's needs with the same unceremonious care she brought to everything. It was Emma who told him about the old mill. "I've seen that dog before," she said one afternoon, watching the puppy eat from a distance. "Out by the old sawmill on Garrett Road. The one shut down since the late 90s. I tried to get close once, about 2 months ago. It just walked away, like it had decided I wasn't the one." Ronan looked at her sideways. "I'm not saying anything," Emma said, and she wasn't. Her voice was perfectly neutral. She was simply telling him where the dog came from, and where it chose to go instead. One evening in late November, the puppy did not come. He waited through the morning and into the afternoon. He sat on the porch until the temperature fell below freezing and his breath was visible in the dark air, telling himself what he always told himself: it was an animal, a stray. It owed him nothing. If it didn't come, that was simply the nature of things that belonged to themselves. He went inside. He stood in the kitchen. He looked at the objects on the table: the rusted ring, the smooth stone, the birch bark, the folded leaf. Each one small enough to close a fist around, each one carried from somewhere by a creature with no particular obligation to carry it anywhere. He got his jacket and his flashlight and walked through the forest to the old mill. The mill appeared first as a darker shape against the dark sky, then resolved into its specific structures as the flashlight found the edges of walls and the angular lines of a collapsed conveyor frame. Ronan moved to the main building, stood at the threshold of the old loading bay, and let the light move slowly across the interior. The puppy was in the far left corner, pressed against the angle where the wall met the floor. When the beam found it, its eyes caught the light. A brief bright flash, and its whole body tensed. Something metallic shifted somewhere above them in the darkness, caught in a draft, and the puppy flinched, hard, its head dropping below its shoulders. Ronan turned the flashlight to the side. He crossed about half the distance and sat down on the cold concrete floor, making himself as small as a man of his size could reasonably manage. "This isn't a good place," he said quietly, not to persuade, just a statement of fact offered into the darkness. "I know you know how to take care of yourself, but this isn't a good place." He stayed for perhaps 20 minutes. The puppy watched him with those unblinking eyes, its breathing gradually slowing. It did not come to him. He did not try to approach further. When his joints had stiffened enough from the cold concrete that staying longer felt more about his own stubbornness than the dog's needs, he stood and walked out. The job offer came on a Tuesday. A resort outside of Bend needed security personnel, early morning shifts, grounds patrol, monitoring the entry point. The manager called with the kind of directness Ronan appreciated. "Here is the job. Here are the hours. Here is the pay." Ronan said he would think about it, set the phone down, and looked out at the porch where the collection of objects sat in their corner. If he was working early shifts, he would leave before the puppy typically arrived. The routine, if a pattern this fragile deserved that word, would be interrupted. He sat with this for a while. He called back within the hour and said he would take the position. That evening, Emma called. "The mill is being demolished," she said. "Garrett County finally pushed through the safety order. They're sending equipment Thursday morning." Ronan set down the mug he'd been holding. "Equipment," he said. "Excavator, plus a crew. It'll be loud." A pause. "I thought you'd want to know." Emma came by the next morning with a soft-sided pet carrier. Mesh panels, padded interior, front zipper. She set it on the porch and crouched beside it without looking at Ronan. "Don't put it between you and the dog. Don't let it feel like a barrier or a trap. Set it somewhere neutral, door open. We may not have time to do this the slow way, but the principle still applies." When the puppy came that afternoon, it moved differently. It emerged from the tree line carrying a small white wildflower, improbably intact, but it stopped 15 feet from the porch, and its gaze went to the carrier. It did not advance. It set the flower on the ground where it stood, looked at the carrier, looked at Ronan, and backed up 3 paces. The air between them had changed, the way air changes in the moment before weather shifts. A pressure differential that isn't yet visible, but is entirely real. Ronan went inside. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at the carrier through the window, and then looked at the objects accumulated in the corner. And something in his chest did a slow, uncomfortable turn. He had spent 12 years in an organization that operated on the principle that outcomes could be controlled through planning, preparation, and sufficient skill. And now he was sitting in a kitchen in Oregon, looking at a pile of things a puppy had carried across 100 yards of forest, and recognizing with a clarity that comes when something very simple is also very true, that he had been doing the wrong thing. He hadn't been trying to help the puppy find safety. He had been trying to arrange the outcome, and the puppy, who had arrived on its own terms and left on its own terms, who had done something remarkable in choosing to come at all, had felt the difference. The carrier was not an invitation. It was control being enacted on someone who had not agreed to it. He thought, without wanting to, of the people who had tried to help him since his discharge. The counselor with pamphlets, the old teammate who called 3 times with suggestions about what Ronan should do next, all of them meaning well. All of them trying to arrange an outcome. He thought about what it had felt like to receive all of that help. How the walls had gone a little higher each time rather than lower. He went to bed without bringing the carrier inside. When he opened the front door at 5:15 the next morning, he stopped. The porch was covered with objects, not in any formal arrangement, but distributed across the boards in a line that ran from the top step to just below his chair. The cord, the stone, the rusted ring, the birch bark, the bottle cap, the first piece of wood, things that had been sitting on the kitchen table, which meant the puppy had come while he was sleeping and carried them back. Or had found duplicates from its own stores, which somehow seemed even more like something he did not have the language to process. And at the end of the line, nearest to the chair, was the small white wildflower from the day before, pressed flat and pale against the boards. The puppy had come in the dark multiple times and left everything it had. Ronan sat down on the top step. He stayed there until the dark became gray, and the gray became the thin cold blue of an Oregon winter dawn. He picked up the first piece of wood, the pale, smooth one from that very first afternoon, and held it in both hands. His throat was doing something he hadn't given it permission to do. He pressed his lips together and breathed through his nose, and thought about what it meant for a creature that had nothing to bring everything it had. He called Emma at 6:30. "I need you to come with me to the mill, today." They drove to the access road behind the property, because Emma had heard the crew was starting early. As they came around the last bend, they could already hear it. The diesel knock of a large engine, the clanging of equipment being unloaded. The excavator sat to the east side of the main building, arm elevated. They went through a gap in the orange safety fencing. The loading bay was at the far end of the structure, not yet in the direct path of work but close. The sounds bounced and echoed off metal and concrete in a way that was, for an animal with acute hearing, almost certainly unbearable. The puppy was in its corner, pressed as flat as it could make itself, both ears laid back, eyes open and tracking but body locked. The stillness of an animal that has concluded movement is the greater risk. Something in the structure shifted overhead, a long metallic complaint from somewhere in the rafters, and the puppy's whole body convulsed, in a single involuntary shudder. Ronan crouched at the entrance to the bay. He reached into his jacket pocket, the piece of wood first, the pale one, the first one. He set it on the concrete floor in front of him, then the bottle cap, the cord, the stone, the ring, the bark, one by one, from his pockets, retrieved from the table that morning before Emma arrived. He laid each one down, making a small semicircle, each object about 6 inches from the next. The wildflower he had wrapped in damp cloth to preserve it, and he placed that last, at the center. For a long moment, the puppy did not move. Then, slowly, in that particular way it had always moved, measured and deliberate, as though each step was a decision rather than a reflex. It uncurled from the corner. It crossed the concrete on quiet paws, nose dropping toward the floor, scenting the objects before it reached them. It moved along the line. The piece of wood it stopped, sniffed carefully, as though verifying something important. The bottle cap, the cord, the stone. Each object received this attention, this consideration, as though the puppy were reviewing a shared ledger, referencing what it had brought against what had been returned. The excavator engine revved beyond the wall. Something metallic rang sharply. The puppy flinched, froze, then continued. When it reached the small ruined flower at the center, it stopped for a long time. It sniffed with focused intensity, its nose barely above the petals, its warm breath shifting them slightly. Then it raised its head. It looked directly at Ronan. Not at the objects, not at the room. At Ronan. The look lasted several seconds, long enough to be deliberate, long enough to be something other than the automatic scanning of a frightened animal assessing its options. Then the puppy walked the remaining distance and pressed its head against Ronan's open hand. Not quickly, not desperately, deliberately, choosing. The pressure was light. A small skull still rounded with youth, the ear soft against his palm. But the intention in it was not light at all. Ronan's hand closed gently around the side of that small head, careful, and the puppy held still beneath it, and neither of them moved for a long time. Emma stood behind them with her hand pressed to her mouth, and did not say a word, because there was nothing to say, because some moments are complete without commentary, Because what she was witnessing was not simply a man adopting a dog, but something more than that. Something she did not have precise language for, but felt with the clarity of certainty. He named the puppy Rusty. It seemed like the right kind of name. Unglamorous, solid, a little worn at the edges, the kind of name that belonged to something that had been through something. Rusty took to it within 3 days, responding with the automatic ear swivel of a dog that has decided it belongs somewhere. The cabin changed. Not dramatically. Nobody watching from outside would have seen a transformation, but Ronan knew the specific quality of the silence that had lived in those rooms, the way it collected in the corners, the particular weight of it in the mornings. And that silence was different now. Rusty was not a noisy dog, had no interest in performing energy, but there was sound, the scratch of small nails on hardwood, the rhythm of drinking, the soft thump of relocating in the night. Small sounds, almost nothing. But they filled the space the silence had occupied, and the space did not feel the same. Emma came more often, which Ronan accepted without analysis. She brought vaccination schedules, the appropriate kibble for a shepherd's growth phase, guidance on basic obedience, which turned out to be less about commands and more about establishing a shared language between two parties already paying close attention to each other. Rusty showed a natural aptitude for this, which was perhaps not surprising for an animal whose entire approach to relationship building had been structured around the giving and receiving of specific objects at specific times. Ronan started the security job on a Monday, 3 weeks after the day at the mill. The resort was 20 minutes away by truck, a property set back from the highway among pines, catering to corporate retreats and outdoor groups. The job was straightforward: patrol the perimeter, monitor the entry, respond to whatever the overnight staff flagged. It required alertness and presence and the willingness to show up. Ronan showed up. He drove in before sunrise, did his rounds in the cold early light, and drove home in the mid-morning. The hours were structured. The structure gave shape to the day. It gave him something to return from. Rusty was always at the door when he got back, not frantic. Just there, sitting inside, nose to the gap at the base of the door, aware of his approach before he reached the porch. There was something in that steadiness, in the fact of being reliably expected without having to perform anything in exchange, that Ronan eventually found the word for: grounding. It grounded him in the way that simple and consistent things can ground a person who has been unmoored. The gifts continued too, though they changed in character. Each morning something small near the front door, a piece of bark from the kindling box, a pebble from the gravel near the truck, the rubber stopper from one of Rusty's toys. He kept them all. The corner of the kitchen table became, without formal decision, their permanent home. The collection had no monetary value, no aesthetic coherence, no purpose that could be explained to anyone who had not been there for its accumulation. It was, by any conventional measure, a pile of debris. But it was evidence that in this place, in this particular arrangement of days, he was not invisible. Something knew he was here, and each morning had done something small about it. This was not nothing. By December he was sleeping better than he had in years. Not perfectly. The nights were not unblemished, and there were still the hours between 2 and 4 when something unnameable moved through him, and he lay on his back and breathed deliberately through the ceiling. But he was sleeping, he was eating, because feeding Rusty had restored the concept of a meal as an event with structure and purpose. He was outside every day, because Rusty needed to be outside, and the cold air and the long light and the smell of pine and damp earth were, he was slowly conceding, good for him in the way that simple physical things are good for people who have been living too much inside their own heads. He called his mother in early December. She answered on the first ring. They talked for 40 minutes. He circled the subject of Rusty the way he circled everything he wasn't quite sure how to explain, until his mother, who had 37 years of experience reading his silences, said, "Ronan, what aren't you telling me?" He told her about the piece of wood on the porch, the bottle cap, the objects on the kitchen table, sitting on cold concrete in an abandoned mill, laying out a puppy's gifts one by one, and a small dog crossing the distance between them. His mother was quiet for a moment. "That sounds like something," she said. "Yeah," Ronan said. It was something. He did not become a different person. He remained who he was. A man formed by 12 years of discipline and sacrifice, carrying memories that don't come out in conversation, aware of a darkness in himself that he had learned to live alongside rather than eradicate. He did not fix what had been broken. He did not arrive at some final, complete state of healed, as though healing were a destination with a sign at the border and a clear moment of crossing. That was not how it worked. He knew that now with more certainty than he'd had leaving the service, but he got up in the mornings with purpose. He drove to work and did the job. He came home to an animal that was glad he had returned. Not because it needed something from him in that moment. Not because his presence was required for anything specific, but simply because he was the person it had chosen, and that choice remained in effect. He kept small, worthless, irreplaceable things in a corner of a table as evidence that something thought of him each day and had gone to the trouble of finding something to bring. He understood, being taken care of in the only way a wild and independent creature knew how to do it. By showing up, by leaving something, by coming back. Some changes don't come loudly. They don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with the kind of before and after clarity that makes a clean story. They come as a piece of pale wood left on a porch step by a creature that weighs less than a bag of flour. They come as a bottle cap and a length of cord and a smooth stone carried across a dark yard by something small that has nothing to offer except what it has managed to find. They come as a door scratched at 6 in the morning, a head pressed into an open palm, a small body warm against your leg on a winter night when the temperature outside drops into the 20s, and the cabin is quiet, and the collection of worthless objects glints faintly in the low lamplight, and you are not invisible, and you are not alone, and you are not gone. Maybe this is how grace works. Not in declarations, not in burning bushes or parted waters, but in the small and the overlooked, in the things we almost miss, in a half-starved puppy that nobody sent, that nobody planned, that simply appeared at the edge of the trees one November afternoon with a piece of wood and a mission it understood better than the man it was meant for. Pay attention to what keeps returning to you. Pay attention to the small things that show up unasked for, that ask nothing in return, that simply sit at your feet and wait. They may not come in the form you would have chosen, but they come, even now, even when you have convinced yourself that nothing is coming, that the season is over, that you have been forgotten by whatever it is that remembers us. Even then, something small moves at the edge of the trees and crosses the yard and sets something down at your feet and says, in the only language it has, you are still here, and that is enough, and I will come back tomorrow.